The silk fell from the shelf and landed at Alara's feet before she could stop it, and the entire shop went silent. "Careful," snapped a voice behind her, sharp as a slap. "That silk isn't for you." Alara turned to find Lady Cassandra Pemberton standing with her arms crossed, her lips curled into a smile that held no warmth at all. Around her stood 3 other women in fine coats, their eyes already dancing with amusement, waiting to see what would happen next. Alara felt her face grow hot. She bent down, picked up the fallen bolt of fabric, and pressed it gently back into place on the shelf, her fingers trembling only slightly. "I was only looking," Alara said quietly. "Looking," Cassandra repeated, as though the word itself were funny. "Darling, looking is free, but touching costs money, and I doubt you have enough coins in that little purse to buy so much as a handkerchief made from this cloth." She reached out and ran her fingers along the deep blue silk, letting it slide between them like water. "This came all the way from the east. It took 3 months to arrive. Every woman of standing in this city has been waiting for it. And you," she added, tilting her head, "you sweep floors for a living, do you not?" A few soft laughs rippled through the small crowd that had gathered near the entrance of the shop. Alara did not sweep floors. She worked as an assistant to her mother, who mended and altered dresses for wealthy families who could not be bothered to sew a single stitch themselves. But she knew that correcting Cassandra would only give her more reason to laugh, so she said nothing at all. "My mother is a seamstress," Alara said finally, keeping her voice steady. "I came to see the new fabric because she asked me to describe it to her. She cannot leave the house today. Her hands ache in this cold weather." "How touching," Cassandra said, though her tone suggested the opposite. "Well, you may describe it to her from memory because you will not be taking any of it home. This silk has already been promised. Every bolt in this shop has buyers waiting, and none of them, I assure you, live on Miller Street." Alara's chest tightened. She had not mentioned where she lived. Cassandra must have asked someone, must have gone out of her way to learn something so small and unimportant just so she could use it as a weapon. It was a strange kind of cruelty, the kind that took effort, the kind that meant someone had been thinking about you long enough to find a way to hurt you. "I only wanted to look," Alara said again, quieter this time. "Then look," Cassandra said, waving a gloved hand toward the door from outside. She turned to her friends and laughed, a bright, careless sound that filled the shop and made the shopkeeper glance nervously toward the back room, as if hoping someone else would come and settle the matter. No one did. Alara set down the small basket she had been carrying, the one meant to hold thread and buttons for her mother's work, and walked toward the door without another word. She would not give Cassandra the satisfaction of seeing her cry, though her eyes stung with the effort of holding back the tears. She had faced this kind of treatment before, more times than she could count, and she had learned long ago that the best answer to cruelty was often silence, because silence could not be mocked the way tears could. As she reached the door, she noticed a man sitting near the far window, half hidden behind a tall shelf of ribbons and lace. He had not spoken during the entire exchange, had not laughed with the others, had not so much as smiled. He was tall, dressed in dark, simple clothing that gave away nothing of his wealth except for the quality of the fabric itself, and his eyes followed Alara with an expression she could not quite name. It was not pity. Pity she would have recognized instantly, would have hated instantly. This was something else, something closer to quiet anger, though it was not directed at her. She did not know his name. She did not think to ask. She simply pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold afternoon air, letting it cool the heat still burning in her cheeks. Behind her, the laughter continued for a moment longer before fading into ordinary conversation, the way laughter always does once its target has left the room. Cassandra returned to admiring the silk, running her fingers over bolt after bolt as though nothing at all had happened, as though she had not just spent several minutes making a stranger feel small in front of half the shop. The man by the window did not join her. He rose slowly from his seat, straightened his coat, and walked to the counter where the shopkeeper stood, still looking uneasy from the scene that had just unfolded. "I would like to purchase the silk," the man said. The shopkeeper blinked. "Which bolt, sir?" "All of it." The shopkeeper's mouth fell open slightly. "Sir, there are 22 bolts remaining. Several have already been promised to." "Unpromise them," the man said simply. "I will pay whatever price you ask, and I will pay it now in full today. Every bolt in this shop belongs to me by the time I walk out that door." Cassandra, who had been listening from a few feet away, turned sharply, her earlier amusement replaced by something closer to alarm. "Excuse me," she said, stepping forward. "I believe I was told this fabric was reserved. My family has an arrangement with this shop." The man did not look at her, he kept his eyes on the shopkeeper. "Arrangements can change," he said. "This one just did." "Do you even know who I am?" Cassandra asked, her voice rising slightly. "I know exactly who you are," the man replied, and something in his tone made even Cassandra fall silent for a moment. "That is precisely why I am doing this." The shopkeeper, sensing that this was not a matter he wished to argue, hurried behind the counter and began writing out the sale. His hands moved quickly, almost nervously, as though he feared the stranger might change his mind if given too much time to think. But the man showed no sign of hesitation. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather case, counting out more money than the shopkeeper had likely seen in a single transaction in many months. "I would like it delivered," the man said, "not here, to an address I will provide." "Of course, sir, and the name for the delivery." The man paused for the first time since he had risen from his seat. He glanced toward the door, toward the space where Alara had stood only minutes before, and something in his expression softened just slightly. "No name," he said, "simply deliver it. She will understand who it is meant for even if she never learns who sent it." The shopkeeper did not argue. Men of clear wealth and quiet authority were not questioned in this part of the city, not when they were paying triple the asking price without so much as blinking. He wrote down the address the man provided, an address on Miller Street, and assured him the delivery would be made before evening. Cassandra watched the entire exchange with growing disbelief, her earlier confidence draining from her face by the second. "This is absurd," she said. "You cannot simply walk in and buy an entire shipment out from underpaying customers." "I can," the man said, finally turning to face her directly, "and I have. If you wish to purchase silk in the future, Lady Pemberton, I would suggest choosing a shop where your manners have not already been noticed by everyone in the room." He said nothing further. He gathered his coat, thanked the shopkeeper once more, and walked out of the shop without a single glance back at the women who stood staring after him, their earlier laughter now replaced by stunned, uncomfortable silence. Outside, the streets were busy with the usual afternoon crowd, carriages rolling past, vendors calling out their wares, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a cart near the corner. Alara had already disappeared into the crowd, walking quickly toward home, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her mind still replaying the humiliation she had just endured. She did not know that behind her, in the shop she had just left, an entire fortune's worth of silk had just changed hands because of her. She did not know that a stranger she had exchanged not a single word with had watched her walk away with her head held high despite everything, and had decided in that quiet moment that cruelty like Cassandra's should not go unanswered. She only knew that her basket was empty, her pride was bruised, and her mother was waiting at home for news of fabric that Alara would now have to describe from memory, because she had not been permitted to touch a single thread of it. She walked the 6 blocks to Miller Street with her chin lifted, refusing to let the sting of the afternoon show on her face, though it burned inside her the entire way. By the time she reached the small house where she and her mother lived above the tailor shop, the cold had numbed her cheeks enough that no one would guess she had been fighting back tears only an hour before. Her mother, Margaret Whitmore, sat by the window with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hands resting in her lap, swollen and aching as they so often were in winter. She looked up when Alara entered, her tired face brightening at the sight of her daughter. "Well," Margaret asked, "did you see it, the silk from the east? Tell me everything, every color, every thread." Alara hesitated only a moment before forcing a smile onto her face. "It was beautiful," she said, "blue as the evening sky and soft as anything I have ever touched." She did not mention that she had touched it for only a single second before it was taken from her. She did not mention Cassandra, or the laughter, or the long walk home with her pride in pieces. Her mother had enough to worry about without adding Alara's small humiliations to the pile. "Blue," Margaret repeated softly, closing her eyes as though she could picture it herself. "I always did love blue silk. Your father bought me a length of it once many years ago before," she stopped, as she always did when memories of Alara's father crept too close to the surface. "Well, never mind that now." Alara sat beside her mother and took her cold hands between her own, rubbing them gently to bring back some warmth. "One day," she said, "I will bring you silk of your own, I promise you that." Margaret smiled, though there was a weariness in it, the smile of a woman who had heard many promises in her life and had learned not to expect too much from any of them. "You are a good daughter," she said. That is worth more than silk." They sat together as the afternoon light faded outside the window, speaking of small things, of the mending work waiting to be finished, of a neighbor's new baby, of nothing important at all. Ilara did not think again of the shop, or of Cassandra, or of the quiet stranger by the window who had watched her leave without saying a single word. She had no way of knowing that even as she sat there, a cart was already making its way toward Miller Street, loaded with more silk than she had ever seen in her life, sent by a man whose name she did not know, for reasons she could not begin to guess. The knock came just as the last light of day was slipping from the sky. Margaret glanced toward the door, confused. They were not expecting visitors, and certainly not deliveries. Ilara rose to answer it, wondering if perhaps a neighbor needed help with an evening meal or a forgotten errand. Instead, she found two men standing on the small stoop outside, each of them holding stacks of fabric so tall they nearly reached their chins, with more still waiting in the cart behind them. "Delivery for this address," one of the men said, checking a small slip of paper in his hand. "Miller Street, the house above the tailor shop." Ilara stared at the fabric in his arms, her breath catching in her throat. Even in the dim evening light, she could see the deep blue color, the very same silk she had touched for only a single second before it was snatched away from her. "There must be some mistake," she said. "We did not order anything." "No mistake, miss. Paid for in full, delivery address confirmed twice by the buyer himself. All 22 bolts if you'll make room." The man glanced past her into the small house, clearly wondering, as she was, whether there was space enough inside to hold it all. 22, Ilara repeated faintly, "all of it." "Every bolt in the shop, miss. That's what the gentleman said. Bought the whole lot right out from under some very unhappy customers, from what I heard." The man gave a small, amused shake of his head, as though he still could not quite believe it himself. "Never seen anything like it in all my years making deliveries." Ilara's mind raced back to the shop, to the tall stranger by the window who had watched everything unfold without a word, who had risen just as she was leaving. She had not even seen his face clearly. She could not have named him if her life depended on it. "Who sent this?" she asked. "There must be a name, a card, something." The man checked his slip of paper again and shook his head. "No name given, miss. Just the address and instructions to deliver everything before nightfall. Paid handsomely to make sure it happened, too, so if you don't mind, we'd best start bringing it in before the light's gone completely." Ilara stepped back from the doorway, still too stunned to fully understand what was happening, and watched as the men began carrying bolt after bolt of silk into the small front room of the house, filling every available space until the room seemed to glow with color, blues and golds and deep, rich reds that caught even the faintest light and turned it into something magical. Margaret had risen from her chair by now, one hand pressed to her chest, staring at the growing pile of fabric with an expression somewhere between wonder and disbelief. "Ilara," she said softly, "what have you done?" "Nothing," Ilara said, though even to her own ears the word sounded uncertain. "I did nothing at all. I only looked at it in the shop." But as she stood there, surrounded by more silk than she had ever imagined owning, she could not help but think of the stranger by the window, his quiet eyes following her out the door, and she wondered, with a small and nervous flutter in her chest, exactly what it meant that a man she had never spoken to had just filled her entire home with the very fabric she had been told was not for her. The last bolt was carried in as full darkness settled over Miller Street, and the delivery men tipped their hats politely before disappearing back into the night, leaving Ilara and her mother alone with a small fortune's worth of silk and no answers at all as to why. Neither of them slept well that night. Margaret sat up late, running her fingers over the silk again and again as though she feared it might vanish if she looked away for too long, while Ilara lay awake in her small bed, staring at the ceiling and turning the mystery over in her mind until it made her head ache. Who would do such a thing, and why? She had done nothing to earn such generosity, nothing except stand quietly while a room full of strangers laughed at her. Perhaps, she thought, that was exactly why. Perhaps someone had seen the unfairness of it and wished to correct it in the only way they knew how. But that explanation troubled her almost as much as it comforted her. Kindness from strangers rarely came without a price, and Ilara had grown up poor enough to know that lesson well. Nothing in this world was truly free. Someone somewhere would expect something in return, even if it took weeks or months for that expectation to reveal itself. By morning, word of the delivery had already begun to spread through the neighborhood. Miller Street was not a large place, and news traveled quickly among its close-set houses and shared courtyards. Neighbors peered through their windows as they passed the tailor shop, whispering to one another about the strange sight of silk bolts stacked from floor to ceiling in the little house above the shop. By midday, 3 separate women had knocked on their door under the pretense of borrowing sugar or thread, each one clearly hoping for a glimpse of the fabric everyone was talking about. Elara answered each visit with polite, careful vagueness, offering no explanation because she had none to give. She could hardly tell her neighbors the truth, mostly because the truth was simply that she did not know it herself. It was her friend Lucy who finally pressed her hardest for answers, arriving that afternoon with a basket of bread under one arm and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Everyone is talking about it," Lucy said, setting the bread down on the table and immediately moving toward the silk, running her hand over the nearest bolt with wide eyes. "They say a gentleman walked into Verity's shop yesterday and bought every single piece of fabric in the place, right in front of Lady Cassandra Pemberton, and had it all sent here. Elara, this is unbelievable. Who is he?" "I don't know," Elara admitted, sinking into a chair with a tired sigh. "I never even learned his name. I only saw him sitting near the window, and he never said a single word to me the entire time I was there." "But you must have some idea," Lucy pressed. "A man does not spend a fortune on silk for a woman he has never spoken to without reason. Was he handsome at least? Old? Young?" Elara thought back to the shop, trying to recall details she had barely noticed at the time, too consumed with her own humiliation to pay much attention to anyone else in the room. "Tall," she said slowly. "Dark hair. Well-dressed, though not showy about it the way some men are. He had a serious sort of face, like someone who does not laugh easily." She paused, remembering the look in his eyes as she had walked past him toward the door. He did not laugh with the others. "When Lady Cassandra was mocking me, he was the only one in the room who did not join in." Lucy's eyebrows rose with interest. "Well, that certainly narrows it down to half the gentlemen in the city," she said dryly, though her tone was gentle rather than mocking. "Elara, you must find out who he is. You cannot simply accept a fortune in silk from a mystery man and ask no questions." "I have no way of finding out," Elara said. "The delivery men gave no name. The shopkeeper likely knows, but I doubt he would tell me even if I asked." "Then ask," Lucy said simply. "Go back to the shop tomorrow and demand to know who purchased the silk. You deserve at least that much, considering it is currently taking up every inch of space in your front room." Elara knew Lucy was right, though the thought of returning to that shop, of possibly facing Cassandra again, made her stomach twist with dread. Still, curiosity and a nagging sense of unease pushed her forward more than any desire for confrontation. She needed to know why a stranger had done something so extraordinary, and whether it was truly a gift or the beginning of some trap she could not yet see. The next morning she made the walk back to the shop, her heart pounding harder with every step. The bell above the door rang as she entered, and the shopkeeper, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Verity, looked up with an expression of immediate recognition, though it quickly shifted into something closer to caution. "Miss Whitmore," he said, setting down the ledger he had been writing in, "I trust the delivery arrived safely." "It did," Elara said. "All 22 bolts exactly as promised. I would like to know who sent it." Mr. Verity glanced toward the back room, as though hoping someone might appear to rescue him from the question. When no one did, he sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I was asked not to give a name," he said. "The gentleman was quite clear on that point." "I understand that," Elara said, "but surely you can tell me something. A description at least. I do not even know if I should be grateful or frightened." Something in her voice must have reached him, because Mr. Verity's expression softened slightly. "You need not be frightened, miss. Whoever he was, he did not strike me as a man with dishonorable intentions. If anything, he seemed rather angry on your behalf, watching how you were treated. I have never seen a purchase made so quickly or with so little concern for the cost." "But who was he?" Elara pressed. "Please, Mr. Verity. I only wish to understand." The shopkeeper hesitated for a long moment before finally lowering his voice, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "I did not recognize him myself, miss, which is unusual, given how many wealthy gentlemen pass through my shop. But my assistant mentioned afterward that she believed she had seen him once before, at a charity function some months ago. She said he was introduced then as the Duke of Ravelmoor, though I cannot say for certain if that is accurate. He keeps to himself, from what I understand, rarely seen in society these days." Elara felt the floor shift slightly beneath her feet. A duke, not simply a wealthy gentleman with more money than sense, but a duke, a man whose name alone could open or close doors throughout the entire kingdom. The idea that such a person had noticed her, had watched her humiliation, and responded to it with an act so extravagant it defied belief, was almost too strange to accept. "The Duke of Ravelmoor," she repeated softly, testing the words as though they might reveal something more if spoken aloud. "That is only what my assistant believes, miss. I would not stake my reputation on it," Mr. Verity said quickly, clearly nervous about having shared even that much. "Please, I would ask that you not mention where you heard it. I have no wish to lose a customer of his standing over idle gossip." Elara assured him she would say nothing, though her mind was already racing far ahead of the conversation, imagining what such a man might want with someone like her, someone who owned nothing, who came from nothing, who had been mocked in his very presence only 2 days before. She left the shop with more questions than she had arrived with, and the walk home did little to settle them. A duke, the word felt heavy and strange in her mouth, entirely unsuited to anything in her own small life. Dukes did not concern themselves with seamstresses' daughters. Dukes married women of noble birth, women with titles and fortunes of their own, women who could stand beside them at grand events without drawing whispers of scandal. Whatever his reasons for the silk, Elara could not imagine that they involved any lasting interest in her. Perhaps, she reasoned, it had simply been a moment of anger on Cassandra's behalf, a small act of rebellion against a woman he clearly did not care for, and Elara herself had merely been a convenient excuse. That explanation made more sense than any other, and though it stung slightly to think she might have been little more than a tool in some private grievance between the Duke and Lady Cassandra, it was far easier to accept than the alternative. She did not have long to sit with her theories, however, because that evening brought an invitation she had not expected at all. It arrived by the hand of a young messenger boy, who knocked politely and handed her a cream-colored envelope sealed with wax bearing an emblem she did not recognize, a stylized letter woven through with what appeared to be a ribbon of thread. Elara turned it over in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. It was an invitation to a charity gala, to be held in 3 days' time at the Grand Hall near the city center, an event meant to raise funds for the orphaned children of the war that had ended some years before. Elara had heard of such galas, of course, though she had never dreamed of attending one herself. They were gatherings for the wealthy, for lords and ladies who wished to be seen doing good works while dressed in their finest clothing. She had certainly never received an invitation to one before. At the bottom of the card, in careful, elegant handwriting, was a single line that made her breath catch entirely. "Wear something blue." There was no signature. There did not need to be. Elara understood immediately what it meant and what fabric she was expected to wear, and by whose hand the invitation had truly been sent, even if his name appeared nowhere on the paper itself. She sat down heavily in the nearest chair, the invitation still clutched in her hands, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions she had no answers to. Why would a duke, a man of such standing that even Lady Cassandra Pemberton dared not challenge him, wish to see her at an event meant for the highest circles of society? What could he possibly want from a woman who owned nothing but a small collection of silk she had not even asked for? Margaret, noticing her daughter's stunned expression, came to sit beside her, gently prying the invitation from her fingers to read it herself. Her eyes widened as she took in the details, the fine paper, the elegant seal, the simple but unmistakable instruction at the bottom. "Elara," she said slowly, "I believe you are about to meet the man who sent that silk." "I do not even know if I want to," Elara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were not entirely true. Some small, curious part of her did want to know, wanted to understand what kind of man would do something so bold and so strange for a woman he had never even spoken to. What would I even say to him? What would I wear? I have nothing suitable for such an event, nothing except— She stopped, glancing toward the front room, toward the towering stacks of blue silk still waiting there, untouched since the night they had arrived. Margaret smiled, the first truly bright smile Elara had seen from her in weeks. "Except everything you could possibly need," she finished softly. "It seems, my dear, that whoever sent this silk already knew exactly what you would require." Over the following days, Margaret worked tirelessly despite the ache in her hands, cutting and stitching the deep blue silk into a gown unlike anything Elara had ever worn in her life. It was not overly elaborate, not dripping with lace or jewels the way some of the wealthiest women's gowns were. but it was elegant in its simplicity, cut to fit Alara's frame perfectly, the fabric catching the light in a way that made it seem almost alive. As the day of the gala approached, Alara found herself caught between excitement and dread in equal measure, unable to decide which feeling was stronger. She thought often of the tall stranger by the window, wondering if she would recognize him among a crowd of unfamiliar faces, wondering what she would say if she did, wondering most of all whether meeting him would answer her questions or only create 100 new ones. She did not know, as she stood before the small, cracked mirror in her room on the night of the gala, smoothing the blue silk over her shoulders with careful hands, that the man who had bought every bolt of that fabric had spent those same 3 days thinking of little else but her, turning his own questions over in his mind with far less certainty than he usually allowed himself, wondering whether he had made a mistake in inviting her into a world that had never been kind to people like her, or whether he had simply set into motion something that neither of them would be able to stop. The grand hall glittered with more candlelight than Alara had ever seen in one place. Hundreds of small flames reflected endlessly in mirrors and crystal, turning the entire room into something that felt more like a dream than a real place a person could actually walk into. Musicians played softly near the far wall, their music weaving through the low hum of conversation and laughter, while servants moved carefully between clusters of finely dressed guests, offering trays of food and drink that Alara did not dare touch for fear of embarrassing herself. She stood near the entrance for several long minutes after arriving, her heart pounding so hard she was certain someone nearby must be able to hear it. She had never felt more out of place in her entire life, despite the beautiful gown wrapped around her, despite the care her mother had taken to style her hair, despite every effort made to help her fit into a world that had never once welcomed her before. "You look as though you are about to run," said a voice beside her, warm and amused. Alara turned to find a woman perhaps a few years older than herself, dressed in soft green, her dark eyes bright with genuine friendliness, rather than the cold amusement Alara had grown used to expecting from strangers in fine clothing. "I feel as though I might," Alara admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. "I'm not entirely certain why I was invited." The woman laughed softly, not unkindly. "None of us are ever entirely certain why we are invited to these things, my dear. I am Charlotte Ashworth, and you are wearing the most extraordinary blue silk I have seen in years. Wherever did you find it?" "It was a gift," Alara said carefully, unsure how much to reveal to a stranger, however friendly she seemed. "A gift," Charlotte repeated, her eyebrows lifting with interest. "From an admirer, I take it. That particular shade has been the talk of every drawing room in the city since Verity's shipment arrived and mysteriously vanished within a single afternoon. Half the women here tonight are still furious they missed their chance at it." Alara felt her cheeks warm, unsure how to respond, but before she could think of anything to say, Charlotte's attention shifted toward something across the room, her expression brightening further. "Ah, speaking of mysteries," Charlotte said, lowering her voice slightly, "there is a man who almost never attends these events, and yet here he stands tonight, looking as though he has somewhere far more important to be. That is the Duke of Ravelmoor, Alastair Voss. I have known him since we were children, though these days he keeps so much to himself that even old friends struggle to draw him out of his own house." Alara followed Charlotte's gaze across the crowded room and felt her breath catch entirely. There he stood, unmistakably the same man who had sat near the window at Verity's shop, watching her with quiet, unreadable eyes while Cassandra tore apart what little confidence she had left. He was dressed tonight in dark formal clothing that suited his tall frame perfectly, and though several people nearby seemed eager to draw him into conversation, he answered each attempt with brief, polite words before his attention drifted elsewhere, as though searching the room for something or someone. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them looked away. "Alara," Charlotte asked, noticing the sudden change in her companion's expression, "do you know the Duke?" "I am not certain," Alara said honestly, though her heart was pounding harder now for entirely different reasons than before. Alastair excused himself from the small group of gentlemen who had been attempting to engage him in conversation about trade routes and crossed the room with unhurried steps, though there was a purpose in his movement that made several heads turn to follow his path. Alara watched him approach with a strange mixture of nervousness and something else she could not quite name, something that felt almost like relief. "Miss Whitmore," he said when he finally reached her, his voice low and steady, entirely different from the cold formality she had expected from a man of his rank. "I am glad you came." "Your Grace," Alara said, dipping into a careful curtsy, uncertain if she was doing it correctly, uncertain of nearly everything in this strange new setting. "I confess I did not know who to thank for the invitation or for the silk until only a few days ago." Something flickered across his face, an expression she could not quite read. "Then Verity told you," he said. "I asked him not to." "He did not mean to," Alara said quickly, worried she might have gotten the kind shopkeeper into trouble. "It was his assistant who mentioned it, and only after I pressed rather hard for an answer. Please do not be angry with him." "I am not angry," Alistair said, and something in his tone suggested this was entirely true. "I suppose I should have known such a thing could not remain a secret forever, particularly not after what I did in front of half the fashionable women in this city." "May I ask why you did it?" Alara said, deciding that if she did not ask now while her courage still held, she might never find the nerve again. "You do not know me, Your Grace. We had never even spoken before that day. I cannot understand why a man of your standing would spend such a fortune on a stranger, simply because she was treated unkindly." Alistair was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as though weighing how much of the truth he was willing to share. Charlotte, sensing that this conversation had moved beyond the point where a third party belonged, quietly excused herself with a knowing smile, leaving the two of them standing somewhat apart from the rest of the crowd. "I watched you walk out of that shop with your head held high," Alistair said finally, "after being treated in a way no person should ever be treated, and you did not cry, and you did not argue, and you did not lower yourself to match the cruelty being shown to you. I have attended countless gatherings filled with men and women of supposedly noble character, and I have rarely seen such genuine dignity in a single moment as I saw in you that day." Alara felt her throat tighten unexpectedly, moved by words she had not been prepared for. "That is a great deal of meaning to place on a single moment, Your Grace." "Perhaps," he admitted, "but I have found that single moments often reveal more about a person's true character than years of careful conversation ever could. Lady Cassandra has spent years perfecting her manners in front of those she wishes to impress, and yet in one unguarded moment she showed exactly who she truly is. You, Miss Whitmore, did the same, though what you revealed was something far different." Alara did not know how to respond to such honesty, so unlike the careful, guarded conversations she had always imagined took place among the wealthy and powerful. "I am not accustomed to such directness," she admitted with a small, uncertain laugh. "Most people I have met prefer to hide their true opinions behind polite words." "I have grown tired of polite words," Alistair said, a faint, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "They rarely say anything worth hearing." They spoke for what felt like only a few minutes but must have been far longer, drifting slowly away from the busiest part of the hall toward a quieter corner near tall windows that looked out over the city's lights. Alara found herself talking more freely than she had expected, telling him about her mother's aching hands and her hopes of one day opening a proper dress shop of their own, about the small joys of her ordinary life that she had never imagined a duke would find remotely interesting. Alistair listened with genuine attention, asking questions that showed he was truly following her words rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. And in return he shared small pieces of his own life, carefully chosen but honest, about the responsibilities of his title, the loneliness of a house too large for one person, the quiet weight of expectations he had carried since he was far too young to understand them. Neither of them mentioned the reason he had first noticed her at all, nor did either of them mention Lady Cassandra, though her name hovered unspoken in the space between certain sentences, as though both of them understood there was more to be said about her eventually, simply not tonight. Across the room, however, Cassandra had noticed everything. She stood near the refreshment table with two of her usual companions, her wine glass forgotten in her hand, as she watched the Duke of Ravelmoor speak with unmistakable interest to a woman she had personally humiliated only days before, a woman who now stood wrapped in the very silk Cassandra had been denied. "Is that not the seamstress's daughter?" one of her companions asked, following Cassandra's gaze. "The one from Verity's shop?" "It is," Cassandra said, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation. How did she even secure an invitation to an event such as this? Surely someone made an error. "No error," Cassandra said, watching as Alistair laughed softly at something Alara had said, an actual laugh, genuine and unguarded, the kind she herself had never once managed to draw from him despite years of careful effort. I suspect the invitation came from the very man standing beside her. Her companions exchanged surprised glances, clearly sensing the tension building beneath Cassandra's carefully composed expression. "You do not seem pleased," one of them ventured cautiously. "Why should I be pleased?" Cassandra snapped, quickly softening her tone as several nearby guests glanced curiously in her direction. She took a slow breath, forcing her expression back into something more socially acceptable. "It simply seems an unusual match, does it not? A duke and a woman who cannot even afford proper gloves." She glanced down at Alara's hands, bare of any jewelry, and felt a small, mean satisfaction in the observation, though it did little to ease the discomfort twisting in her chest. She had spent years positioning herself carefully within society, attending every gathering the Duke of Ravelmoor might possibly appear at, engaging him in conversation whenever the opportunity presented itself, all in careful pursuit of a match that would elevate her family's fortunes and secure her place among the highest circles for the rest of her life. She had never once succeeded in drawing more than polite, distant courtesy from him, no matter how much effort she invested. And now, in a single evening, a woman with nothing had managed what Cassandra had failed to achieve in years of careful strategy, simply by existing, simply by being treated unfairly, and catching the attention of a man who apparently valued quiet dignity over careful ambition. The unfairness of it burned in her chest like a coal that refused to cool. "I believe," Cassandra said slowly, watching Alara laugh at something Alistair had said, watching him lean slightly closer to hear her better over the noise of the crowd, "that this situation requires closer attention." Meanwhile, unaware of the storm quietly building on the other side of the hall, Alara found herself asking a question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the moment she had first seen Alistair's face reflected across the crowded room. "Why did you truly buy all that silk, Your Grace?" she asked. "I do not think you have told me the full truth of it yet." Alistair's expression grew momentarily more serious, the easy warmth of their earlier conversation giving way to something quieter, more careful. "There was someone in my life once," he said slowly, "who was treated unfairly by people who considered themselves above her, simply because of where she came from rather than who she truly was. I was not able to help her the way I wished I could have, and I have carried that failure with me for a long time. When I saw what happened to you, I suppose I saw an opportunity to do what I had once been unable to do." "I am sorry," Alara said softly, sensing the depth of pain behind his carefully measured words, though she did not press for more details than he seemed willing to offer, "for whatever happened to her." "As am I," Alistair said, and for a brief moment, something raw and unguarded flickered across his face before he carefully smoothed it away again. "But that is a story for another time, perhaps, if you are willing to hear it eventually." "I would be," Alara said, and she meant it entirely, surprising herself with how easily the words came, how naturally she found herself wanting to know more about this quiet, complicated man who had turned her ordinary life upside down with a single extraordinary act of kindness. They spoke for the remainder of the evening, drifting occasionally into conversation with others who approached, though Alistair always found his way back to her side within minutes, as though unwilling to let too much distance settle between them. By the time the gala began to wind down and guests started making their way toward waiting carriages, Alara realized she had spent nearly the entire evening beside a duke, and rather than feeling out of place, she had felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and comfortably herself. Alistair insisted on seeing her safely to her carriage, offering his arm as they walked together through the thinning crowd, ignoring the curious glances that followed them the entire way. "Thank you," Alara said as they reached the waiting carriage, "for the silk and for tonight. I still do not fully understand why you have done any of this, but I find that I am glad you did." "Perhaps," Alistair said, his eyes holding hers with a warmth that made her breath catch slightly, "some things do not need to be fully understood in order to be appreciated." He helped her into the carriage, his hand steady and warm around hers for the brief moment their fingers touched. "I hope we shall speak again soon, Miss Whitmore." "I hope so too, Your Grace," Alara said, and as the carriage pulled away from the grand hall, she found herself glancing back through the small window, watching him stand there in the candlelight, tall and solitary, until the darkness of the city streets finally swallowed him from view. She did not notice Cassandra watching the entire farewell from a nearby window, her expression cold and calculating, her mind already turning over the beginnings of a plan that would ensure this unlikely romance did not survive much longer than the fragile silk it had been born from. In the weeks that followed the gala, Alastair found reasons to visit Miller Street more often than any duke had ever been seen visiting such a modest neighborhood before. At first, his visits were brief and carefully explained, a matter of confirming Alara's comfort with the silk, a question about whether the delivery had caused any trouble with her neighbors, small excuses that grew thinner and less convincing each time he offered them. By the third visit, he no longer bothered pretending he needed a reason at all. Margaret, though initially wary of a duke taking such obvious interest in her daughter, found herself gradually won over by his quiet manners and the genuine respect he showed toward both of them. He never spoke down to her despite her humble circumstances, never treated her aching hands or her simple home as anything to be embarrassed about. He asked after her health with what appeared to be real concern, and on more than one occasion, he arrived with small gifts meant specifically for her comfort, a warm shawl for the winter months, a jar of salve recommended by his own physician for the pain in her joints. "You do not need to win my favor, Your Grace," Margaret told him once, amused despite herself as she accepted yet another thoughtful gift. "I am not the one you are courting." "Perhaps not," Alastair said, "but I have found that a woman's mother often holds more influence over her happiness than anyone realizes, and I would rather earn your goodwill honestly than assume it comes automatically with my title." Margaret had laughed at that, a genuine, warm sound that Alara had not heard from her mother in longer than she could remember, and from that day forward, any lingering doubts Margaret harbored about the Duke's intentions began to fade entirely. For Alara, the growing closeness between herself and Alastair felt like stepping slowly into a warmth she had never expected to know in her lifetime. He was nothing like the cold, distant image society had painted of him, the recluse who avoided gatherings and spoke to almost no one outside his own small circle. With her he was thoughtful and curious, quick to laugh at things she said, patient in listening to her worries about the future, honest in ways that made her trust him more with each passing conversation. They walked together often through the quieter parts of the city, away from the busiest streets where curious eyes might follow them too closely, speaking of everything and nothing, of childhood memories and half-formed dreams, of the strange, unexpected way their lives had collided over a single bolt of blue silk. Alastair told her slowly and in pieces more about the woman he had lost, a cousin raised alongside him who had been treated cruelly by their own family for the simple crime of being born to a mother society considered beneath their standing. He had been too young then to protect her the way he wished he could have, and her early death, quiet and largely unmourned by anyone but him, had left a wound that had never fully closed. "I have spent years keeping people at a distance," he admitted to her one afternoon as they walked along a quiet path near the river, the autumn air crisp and cool around them. "It felt safer than allowing myself to care for someone again, only to lose them, or to watch them suffer the same unfairness she suffered. But you make it very difficult to keep that distance, Alara." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal address that had marked their earlier conversations, and something in the simple sound of it warmed her more than she cared to admit aloud. "I am not going anywhere, Alastair," she said softly, using his name in return for the first time as well, testing the weight of it on her tongue. "Whatever comes of this, whatever anyone else might say about it, I intend to remain exactly where I am." He smiled at that, a real, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his eyes, and for a moment, standing together beside the quiet river with autumn leaves drifting past them, the rest of the world and all its judgments felt very far away indeed. But the rest of the world had not forgotten them, and it was drawing closer with every passing day. Lady Cassandra had spent the weeks since the gala gathering information with the same careful diligence she once applied to securing invitations and favorable seating arrangements at fashionable events. She learned everything she could about Alara Whitmore, her modest upbringing, her father's early death, the small debts her mother's shop had accumulated during difficult winters, the neighbors who might be persuaded, with the right encouragement, to share unflattering rumors about a family they barely knew. None of it amounted to anything truly damaging on its own. Alara had lived an honest, unremarkable life, entirely free of the kind of scandal Cassandra had hoped to uncover. But Cassandra had learned long ago that truth mattered far less in society than perception, and perception could be shaped with enough patience and the right choice of words dropped into the right ears. She began slowly, careful not to draw suspicion toward herself. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, small seeds of doubt planted among the wives and daughters of influential families who had attended the gala and witnessed the Duke's unusual attention toward an unknown woman in blue silk. "I do wonder," she said one afternoon to a small gathering of acquaintances over tea, her tone carefully light and thoughtful, "whether the Duke fully understands the young woman's circumstances. It seems rather sudden, does it not, this sudden fortune of silk and invitations? One does have to ask oneself what a woman in her position might hope to gain from such attention." "Surely you do not suggest she is scheming after his title," one of the women said, though her expression suggested the seed had already taken root. "I suggest nothing at all," Cassandra said, sipping her tea with practiced innocence. "I simply find it curious, that is all. A duke, wealthy and unmarried, suddenly showering attention and expensive gifts upon a woman with nothing to her name. One cannot help but wonder who benefits most from such an arrangement." The comment spread exactly as Cassandra intended, whispered from drawing room to drawing room, gathering small additions and exaggerations with each retelling, until within a fortnight, half of fashionable society had convinced themselves that Alara Whitmore was little more than an ambitious woman who had somehow managed to trap an unsuspecting duke with false charm and calculated humility. Alara remained largely unaware of the growing rumors at first, occupied as she was with the simple happiness of her growing bond with Alastair and the daily work of helping her mother manage their small business. It was Lucy who finally brought the unwelcome news to her attention, arriving one evening with a troubled expression that immediately set Alara on edge. "You must hear this from someone who cares for you rather than from a stranger's cruel gossip," Lucy said, settling into a chair with obvious discomfort. "There are rumors spreading through the city, Alara, ugly ones, about you and the Duke." "What kind of rumors?" Alara asked, though something in her chest already tightened with dread before Lucy even answered. "That you have deliberately pursued him for his fortune and title," Lucy said carefully. "That the entire situation with the silk was somehow arranged by you, perhaps even that you insulted yourself deliberately in front of Lady Cassandra simply to draw his sympathy and attention." Alara felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs entirely. "That is absurd," she said. "I did nothing of the sort. I did not even know his name until days after the silk arrived." "I know that," Lucy said gently, reaching out to take her friend's hand. "Anyone who truly knows you would know that as well, but rumors do not care for truth, Alara. They care only for how interesting they sound when repeated, and I am afraid this particular story is proving very interesting indeed to certain circles." Alara spent that night unable to sleep, her mind consumed with worry not for herself entirely, but for what such rumors might mean for Alastair, for the reputation he had spent years carefully guarding, for the family name he carried and the responsibilities that came with it. She had never wished to become a burden to him, never wished for her presence in his life to cause him difficulty of any kind. When Alastair visited the following afternoon, she could not bring herself to hide her distress, and the moment he saw her troubled expression, his own face grew serious with concern. "What has happened?" he asked, taking a seat beside her, his hand covering hers with gentle reassurance. She told him everything Lucy had shared, watching his expression darken with each word, though his anger, she noted with some relief, seemed directed entirely at the source of the rumors rather than at her. "I know exactly where this has come from," he said once she had finished, his voice tight with restrained frustration. "Lady Cassandra has never taken kindly to rejection, and she has clearly decided that if she cannot have my attention herself, she will do everything in her power to ensure no one else can enjoy it peacefully either." "Perhaps it would be easier," Alara said quietly, though the words felt like ash in her mouth even as she spoke them, "if we simply stopped seeing one another for a while, until the rumors fade on their own." Alastair turned to face her fully, his expression firm in a way she had not seen from him before. "Is that truly what you wish?" he asked. "Or is it only what you believe would be easier for me?" Alara hesitated, unable to meet his eyes for a moment. "I do not wish to be the cause of difficulty for you," she admitted. "You have a name to protect, responsibilities that matter to more people than just yourself. I have nothing to lose in this except my own reputation, but you—" "Alara," he interrupted gently, "look at me." She did, finding his eyes steady and certain in a way that eased some of the fear tightening in her chest. I have spent years allowing other people's opinions to dictate the shape of my life, avoiding society, avoiding connection, all because I feared what people might say or think. I am done living that way. If Lady Cassandra wishes to spread lies about you, then let her. I would rather stand beside you and face whatever whispers come our way than retreat into safety and lose the one thing that has made me genuinely happy in longer than I can remember. Tears gathered in Alara's eyes at his words, though they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "You are certain?" she asked softly. "Entirely certain," Alistair said, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "Let them talk, Alara. We know the truth of what exists between us, and that is worth far more than the approval of people who have never once shown either of us genuine kindness." But even as he spoke those brave, reassuring words, neither of them could yet imagine how far Lady Cassandra was truly prepared to go, nor how close her scheming would soon bring them both to losing everything they had begun to build together. When gentle rumors failed to separate Alara from the Duke, Lady Cassandra decided that gentler methods had simply run their course. She sat alone in her private study late one evening, a glass of wine untouched beside her, turning over every possible avenue left to her with the same cold calculation she had once reserved for securing invitations to the season's most exclusive events. She thought of Margaret Whitmore's small tailoring business, modest but steady, providing just enough income to keep the small household afloat through difficult winters. She thought of the landlord who owned the building above which Margaret and Alara lived, a man named Mr. Higgins who, Cassandra had learned through careful inquiry, held significant debts of his own to a merchant closely connected with Cassandra's own family fortune. It did not take much persuasion at all. A quiet word here, a subtle reminder of favors owed there, and within days, Margaret received a formal notice informing her that her lease would not be renewed at the end of the current quarter, and that several of her regular clients, wealthy families who had trusted her with their finest garments for years, had suddenly and without explanation decided to take their business elsewhere. Margaret brought the notice to Alara with trembling hands, her earlier optimism entirely drained from her face. "I do not understand," she said, sinking into her chair by the window. "Mr. Higgins has always spoken well of our arrangement, and Lady Farrow and the Bentons, they have been loyal customers for over a decade. Why would they abandon us so suddenly and all at once?" Alara felt a cold certainty settle over her even before she finished reading the notice herself. "This is Cassandra's doing," she said quietly. "I am certain of it." "Surely even she would not go so far," Margaret said, though her voice lacked real conviction. "She has already spread lies about my character throughout half the city," Alara said. "I do not think there is much she would consider beneath her, if it means separating me from Alistair." The full weight of what was happening settled over her slowly, and with it came a fierce, protective anger unlike anything she had felt before. She could accept unkind words directed at herself. She had endured that her entire life, and she had learned to withstand it without breaking. But watching her mother's livelihood threatened, watching years of honest, careful work unraveled simply to serve someone else's jealous scheming, was something Alara found far more difficult to bear quietly. She did not tell Alistair immediately, uncertain whether involving him further would only deepen the danger, but Lucy, sensing her friend's distress during a visit later that week, pressed the truth from her within minutes, and immediately insisted that Alistair needed to know everything. "He would want to help," Lucy said firmly. "And more than that, Alara, he deserves to know exactly what kind of person Lady Cassandra truly is, especially if he still harbors any lingering courtesy toward her from their years of acquaintance." Reluctantly, Alara agreed, and when Alistair arrived the following day and learned of the threat to Margaret's livelihood, his expression grew colder and more determined than Alara had ever witnessed. "This ends now," he said simply. "I have allowed Cassandra's petty scheming to continue for far too long out of some misguided sense of old familiarity between our families. That courtesy clearly means nothing to her, and I see no reason to extend it any further." That same afternoon, Alistair paid a personal visit to Mr. Higgins, and whatever was discussed between them remained unknown to Alara, though the following morning brought a new notice, this one reversing the earlier decision entirely and offering profuse, nervous apologies for what Mr. Higgins now claimed had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Similarly, within days, two of the three families who had abruptly withdrawn their business quietly resumed their regular orders, their explanations for the sudden change equally vague and unconvincing. But Alastair's swift intervention, while it resolved the immediate crisis, did little to address the deeper problem, and Cassandra, humiliated by the failure of her carefully orchestrated plan, only grew more determined rather than less. It was around this time that Alastair's valet, a loyal but occasionally careless man named Edmund, who had served the Voss family for over a decade, made an error that would ultimately reveal far more than he intended. Edmund had grown genuinely fond of Alara during her visits to the Ravelmoor estate, appreciating her kindness toward the household staff, a courtesy not always extended by those of higher birth, and in a moment of misplaced trust, he mentioned to a fellow servant, who happened to have a cousin employed within Lady Cassandra's own household, certain private details regarding the Duke's growing plans. The details themselves were not scandalous. Alastair had begun quietly making arrangements for a formal courtship, intending to eventually seek Margaret's blessing and, in time, propose marriage to Alara in a manner both proper and public, free from any further whispers of impropriety. But when this information reached Cassandra through her servant's careless cousin, it struck her with the force of a physical blow. Marriage, not simply infatuation, not simply a passing interest that might eventually fade under enough social pressure, but genuine, deliberate intention toward a permanent union. Everything Cassandra had worked toward for years, every careful strategy and calculated appearance, was about to be rendered utterly meaningless by a seamstress's daughter who had done nothing more than exist with quiet dignity in the wrong place at the wrong time. Something in Cassandra shifted that evening, her calculated scheming giving way to something more desperate and less carefully controlled. She could not simply allow the marriage to happen, she would not allow it. Her final plan was both simpler and more dangerous than anything she had attempted before. She would ensure that Alara's reputation was damaged so thoroughly, so publicly, that no amount of the Duke's influence or affection could repair it, and she would do so at an event where the entire fashionable world would witness the destruction firsthand. An opportunity presented itself soon enough. A grand ball was to be held at the estate of Lord and Lady Harrington, one of the final significant gatherings before the winter season fully settled over the city, and Alastair, determined to make his intentions publicly known and to silence the rumors once and for all, had already decided to attend with Alara as his openly acknowledged companion. Cassandra learned of this plan easily enough and began preparing her own counterattack with meticulous care. She spent days crafting a story, one that wove together small threads of truth with carefully constructed fabrication, suggesting that Alara had a history of manipulating wealthy men for financial gain, that her father's early death had not been the simple tragedy everyone believed, but had instead been connected to gambling debts and disreputable associations that Alara herself had conveniently concealed. None of it was true. Alara's father had been a kind, hardworking man who had died of illness after years of honest labor, leaving behind nothing more scandalous than modest debts accumulated during his final difficult months of medical care. But Cassandra understood that truth mattered little when a story was told with enough confidence and repeated by enough respected voices, and she had already secured the cooperation of two minor, financially struggling nobles willing to lend false credibility to her claims in exchange for quiet promises of future favor. Alara remained entirely unaware of the storm being carefully assembled against her as she prepared for the Harrington ball, focused instead on the simple happiness of Alastair's growing devotion, and the quiet hope that perhaps, finally, the worst of society's judgment had passed them by. She did not yet understand that the true test of everything they had built together was still to come, and that it would arrive not through quiet scheming in shadowed drawing rooms, but in the full blazing light of a ballroom filled with hundreds of watching eyes, where reputations could be built or destroyed within the span of a single evening, and where Cassandra Pemberton had decided, with cold and desperate determination, that she would settle the matter once and for all. Meanwhile, Alastair spent those same days consulting quietly with Edmund, sensing that something had shifted in the atmosphere of the city's gossip, though he could not yet identify precisely what Cassandra intended. Edmund, racked with guilt over his earlier carelessness, finally confessed his suspicion that he had inadvertently revealed private information that had somehow made its way to Cassandra's household. "I am deeply sorry, Your Grace," Edmund said, his hands twisting nervously in front of him. "I never intended for such details to travel beyond our own walls." Alastair, though frustrated by the breach, found he could not fully blame his loyal servant for a moment of misplaced trust. "What is done," he said, though his expression remained troubled. "But we must prepare ourselves, Edmund. If Cassandra has learned of my intentions toward Alara, I fear she will not simply accept defeat quietly. Whatever she is planning, it will likely come soon, and it will likely come publicly. Shall I have inquiries made, Your Grace? Perhaps we can learn more of her plans before they unfold." "Do what you can," Alistair said, "but discreetly. I do not wish to give her further reason to accelerate whatever scheme she has constructed. If she believes she still holds the element of surprise, perhaps we can use that against her when the moment comes." He did not share his growing concerns with Alara directly, unwilling to burden her with worry over threats that remained, for the moment, only suspicion rather than certainty. Instead, he focused his energy on ensuring that when the Harrington ball arrived, he would stand beside her with absolute, unwavering support, prepared to face whatever challenge the evening might bring. In the days leading up to the event, Alara found herself once again standing before the small, cracked mirror in her room, this time fitting a new gown crafted from the remaining silk, a deep, elegant gold that Margaret had transformed with careful, loving stitches into something that made Alara feel, for the first time in her entire life, as though she truly belonged among the finest company the city had to offer. "You look beautiful," Margaret said softly, adjusting a final fold of fabric at her daughter's shoulder. "Your father would have been so proud to see you like this." "I wish he could have met Alistair," Alara said quietly, a familiar ache rising in her chest at the mention of her father, gone now for nearly 5 years but never entirely absent from her thoughts. "He would have approved," Margaret said with certainty. "Any man who treats you with such genuine respect and kindness would have earned your father's blessing within a single conversation." Alara smiled, though a small, nervous flutter remained beneath the surface of her happiness, an instinct she could not quite name but could not fully ignore either, a quiet sense that something significant and possibly difficult was waiting for her on the other side of the coming evening. She had no way of knowing just how right that instinct truly was, nor how close she would come, within the very same night, to losing everything she had only just begun to believe she deserved. The Harrington estate glowed with light from every window as carriages arrived in a steady stream along the long, curving drive, delivering guests dressed in their finest evening wear for what promised to be the most talked-about gathering of the entire season. Inside, the great ballroom stretched beneath high ceilings painted with scenes of gods and clouds, chandeliers blazing overhead, casting warm golden light across polished marble floors already filling with dancers. Alara arrived on Alistair's arm, her gold silk gown catching the light with every movement, and though she felt the familiar weight of curious stares following her entrance, she found she could bear them more easily now, standing beside a man whose steady presence had become, in these past weeks, a source of genuine strength rather than mere comfort. "You look radiant," Alistair murmured as they made their way through the entrance hall, ignoring the whispers that followed in their wake. "Whatever happens tonight, remember that." "You are speaking as though you expect trouble," Alara said, glancing up at him with a small frown. "I am simply prepared for it," he said carefully, unwilling to voice his suspicions aloud and risk dampening her evening before it had even properly begun. "Nothing more than that." They moved through the early hours of the ball much as they had at the previous gala, dancing together, speaking with the handful of genuine friends they had made along the way, including Charlotte, who greeted Alara warmly and seemed entirely delighted by the obvious happiness radiating between the couple. For a time, it seemed as though the evening might pass peacefully, the earlier rumors fading into background noise beneath the music and laughter filling the grand hall. Then, near the midpoint of the evening, as guests gathered near the refreshment tables during a brief pause in the dancing, Lady Cassandra made her move. She arrived at the center of a small but growing crowd with practiced timing, her voice carrying just loud enough to draw attention without appearing deliberately staged, though every word had been carefully rehearsed in the privacy of her own chambers over the preceding days. "I find it truly remarkable," she said, addressing a cluster of acquaintances but pitching her voice for wider effect, "how quickly some people manage to secure a duke's affection through nothing more than a well-timed sad story. Though I suppose when one's own father's reputation involves such unfortunate associations, a woman learns early how to spin tragedy into sympathy." A ripple of confused murmuring spread outward from her words, several guests turning curiously toward Alara, who stood frozen for a moment, uncertain she had heard correctly. "I beg your pardon," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the sudden pounding of her heart. Cassandra turned toward her with an expression of practiced, false concern. "Oh, forgive me. I assumed you would have shared the truth of your father's circumstances with the Duke by now, given how close you two have become. Though I suppose certain details are easier left buried, especially when a title and fortune are within reach." "My father was an honest man," Ilara said, her voice rising slightly despite her effort to remain composed. "He worked hard his entire life and died from illness, nothing more." "Is that truly what you believe?" Cassandra asked, her tone dripping with false sympathy as she turned to address the gathering crowd more directly now, several dozen guests having paused their own conversations to watch the unfolding scene with undisguised interest. "I have it on reliable authority that Mr. Whitmore left behind significant gambling debts, connections to men of rather disreputable character, debts that conveniently vanished from public record. Around the same time, his young daughter began seeking the favor of wealthy patrons willing to overlook such unfortunate family history." The accusation, absurd and entirely fabricated though it was, landed with visible impact among the listening crowd, whispers spreading rapidly as guests turned to one another with raised eyebrows and knowing glances. Ilara felt the ground shift beneath her, a familiar helplessness rising in her chest as she realized how quickly a carefully constructed lie could take root among people eager for scandal, regardless of its truth. "That is a lie," Ilara said, her voice trembling now despite her best efforts to remain calm. "A complete and deliberate lie." "Is it?" Cassandra pressed, sensing victory within reach and pushing further. "Then perhaps you would care to explain why your family's shop nearly lost its lease so suddenly, or why several respectable families abruptly withdrew their business, if there is truly nothing untoward in your history." "I have heard whispers, Miss Whitmore, whispers I have been reluctant to give voice to out of simple kindness, but perhaps the truth deserves to be known by everyone gathered here tonight, particularly given how close you have grown to a man of such significant standing." Alistair, who had been momentarily separated from Ilara's side while retrieving refreshments, returned just in time to hear the final accusations, his expression darkening rapidly as he took in the scene before him, Ilara standing alone and visibly shaken at the center of a crowd whispering among themselves, Cassandra positioned nearby with an expression of carefully practiced sympathy that fooled no one who truly knew her character. "Lady Cassandra," Alistair said, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd with quiet, unmistakable authority as he moved swiftly to stand beside Ilara, "I believe you owe Miss Whitmore an immediate and public apology." "An apology?" Cassandra said, feigning surprise. "Your Grace, I have said nothing but what has been shared with me by reliable sources. Surely you would not wish to remain ignorant of your companion's true circumstances, particularly given how far your association with her has progressed." "I know Miss Whitmore's circumstances entirely," Alistair said, his voice growing colder with each word. "I know that her father was an honest, hardworking man who died from illness, leaving behind nothing more scandalous than the ordinary debts any family accumulates during difficult medical circumstances. I know that her family's business faced sudden difficulty recently, difficulty that was resolved the very same day I personally spoke with her landlord, a conversation during which certain troubling connections to your own household became rather apparent." A fresh wave of murmuring spread through the crowd at this, several guests exchanging startled glances as the true nature of the conflict began to reveal itself more clearly. "I do not know what you are suggesting," Cassandra said, though a slight tremor had entered her voice now, the first crack in her carefully maintained composure. "I am suggesting," Alistair said, stepping closer, his voice pitched now to carry clearly across the entire hushed hall, "that you have spent the past several weeks engaged in a deliberate campaign to destroy an innocent woman's reputation and threaten her family's livelihood, purely out of jealousy over an affection you were never entitled to and never earned. I am suggesting that the story you have just told this gathering is a fabrication constructed from whole cloth, designed to inflict maximum damage with minimum evidence, in the hope that scandal alone would be enough to accomplish what your own charm and character never could." The hall had fallen almost entirely silent now, every eye fixed on the unfolding confrontation, the orchestra having quietly ceased playing somewhere in the midst of the exchange, without anyone quite noticing the transition. "How dare you accuse me of such things in front of everyone?" Cassandra said, her voice rising with genuine anger now, the careful mask finally slipping entirely away. "How dare I?" Alistair repeated, something almost cold and dangerous entering his tone despite its continued quiet control. "You have spent weeks attempting to destroy a woman who has done nothing but endure your cruelty with more grace than you have ever shown anyone in your entire life. You threatened her mother's business. You spread lies about her family. And tonight, you have stood in front of this entire gathering and fabricated accusations against a man who can no longer defend himself, simply to serve your own wounded pride. I dare a great deal, Lady Cassandra, because I have watched you do far worse to someone who has never once wronged you." Ilara, finding her own voice again amid the shock of the confrontation, stepped forward slightly, addressing the crowd directly for the first time. "My father died 5 years ago from a fever that took him within a matter of weeks," she said, her voice steadier now, strengthened by Alistair's unwavering support beside her. "He left behind no gambling debts, no disreputable associations, nothing except the honest memory of a man who worked every day of his life to provide for his family. I invite anyone here tonight who wishes to verify this to speak with our neighbors on Miller Street, who knew him personally for over 20 years, or with the physician who attended him during his final illness, whose records remain available to anyone genuinely interested in the truth rather than convenient gossip." Her words, delivered with quiet dignity rather than desperate defensiveness, seemed to land more effectively among the watching crowd than any amount of anger could have. Several guests nearby exchanged uncertain glances, clearly reconsidering their earlier readiness to believe Cassandra's accusations. Lord Harrington himself, whose home had unwittingly become the setting for this dramatic confrontation, stepped forward with the measured authority of a man determined to restore order to his own gathering. "Lady Cassandra," he said firmly, "these are serious accusations you have made this evening, accusations that appear, based on what has just been shared, to lack any genuine foundation. I would ask that you either provide concrete evidence to support your claims immediately, or offer an apology to Miss Whitmore befitting the severity of the harm you have caused her reputation this evening." Cassandra looked around the hall, taking in the shifting expressions of guests who had, only minutes before, hung on her every word with eager interest, and now regarded her instead with growing suspicion and discomfort. She had gambled everything on this single moment, certain that a well-placed accusation delivered with sufficient confidence would be enough to destroy Ilara entirely, and instead, she found herself standing exposed and increasingly isolated in the center of the very spotlight she had intended for someone else. "I have nothing further to say," Cassandra said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled fury and humiliation, before turning sharply and making her way toward the nearest exit, her earlier companions hesitating awkwardly before hurrying to follow her, unwilling to be associated too closely with such a public and thorough unraveling. The hall remained quiet for a long moment after her departure before conversation slowly began to resume, hushed and uncertain at first, gradually building back toward its earlier volume as guests processed what they had just witnessed. Alistair turned to Ilara, his expression softening entirely now that the immediate confrontation had passed, concern replacing the controlled anger that had dominated his features only moments before. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, taking her hands in his own. "I am," Ilara said, though her voice still carried a slight tremor from the intensity of the past several minutes. "Thank you for standing beside me. I do not know that I could have faced that alone." "You would not have needed to face it alone," Alistair said firmly. "Not tonight and not ever again if I have any say in the matter." Charlotte appeared at their side moments later, her expression a mixture of concern and quiet satisfaction. "That was quite the display," she said. "I do believe Lady Cassandra has finally overreached herself beyond any hope of recovery. I have never seen her so thoroughly humbled in front of so many witnesses." "I take no pleasure in her humiliation," Ilara admitted, surprising herself slightly with the honesty of the sentiment, "only in the fact that the truth was finally heard." "That is precisely why you deserve every bit of happiness you have found," Charlotte said warmly, squeezing Ilara's hand before allowing the couple a moment of privacy amid the slowly recovering festivities. As the evening gradually returned to something resembling its earlier warmth, Alistair guided Ilara toward a quieter corner near the same tall windows where they had first spoken so freely at the previous gala, the city lights glimmering faintly in the darkness beyond the glass. "I must ask you something," he said, his earlier composure giving way to something more vulnerable, more uncertain than she had ever seen from him before. "Anything?" Alara said softly. "I know that tonight has been difficult, and I know that our path forward will likely continue to face challenges from those who believe your birth should determine your worth," he said carefully. "But I find that I no longer wish to wait for society's approval before declaring what I already know in my own heart. Alara, I have never felt as at peace with anyone as I feel with you, and I do not wish to spend another day pretending otherwise, regardless of what anyone else might say." Alara's breath caught, understanding the weight building behind his words even before he finished speaking them, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief that made the rest of the crowded ballroom fade entirely from her awareness. But before he could say anything further, a commotion near the entrance of the hall drew both their attention, along with that of everyone else nearby, as a breathless messenger arrived carrying urgent news that would delay, though not diminish, the significance of the moment Alistair had been building toward. The messenger, a young boy no older than 12, pushed his way through the crowd with obvious distress, his eyes searching the hall until they landed on Alara's gold gown, easily recognizable even amid the sea of elegant guests. "Miss Whitmore," he gasped, out of breath from what had clearly been a considerable run. "You must come quickly. There has been a fire near Miller Street. Your mother's shop, miss, it caught late this evening. A lamp overturned, they believe, spread quickly through the front room before anyone could stop it." Alara felt the color drain entirely from her face, the earlier joy of Alistair's unfinished declaration vanishing instantly beneath a rising tide of panic. "My mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is she safe?" "Please tell me she is safe." "She is, miss," the boy said quickly, seeing her distress. "A neighbor pulled her out before the flames reached the back rooms where she sleeps. She is shaken and coughing something terrible from the smoke, but she is alive and being cared for by Mrs. Bellamy down the street." Relief flooded through Alara so intensely that her knees nearly buckled beneath her, and Alistair's steady arm around her waist was the only thing that kept her upright in that moment. "Take me to her," Alara said immediately. "Now, please." "Of course," Alistair said, already moving them both toward the exit, calling out quickly for his carriage to be readied without delay. Charlotte, sensing the severity of the situation, hurried alongside them, offering whatever assistance she could as they made their way swiftly through the thinning crowd, ignoring the curious murmurs that followed their hasty departure. The carriage ride to Miller Street felt endless despite its actual brevity, Alara's mind consumed with fear and uncertainty, imagining every possible outcome, each one worse than the last. Alistair held her hand tightly the entire way, offering quiet, steady reassurance, though his own expression betrayed genuine concern as well. When they finally arrived, the scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos. Neighbors gathered along the street with buckets and blankets, the acrid smell of smoke still heavy in the cold night air. The front of the small building that had housed Margaret's shop and their modest living quarters above it stood scorched and damaged. Though the surrounding structures appeared to have been spared any serious harm, the fire having been contained before it could spread further. Alara found her mother wrapped in blankets inside Mrs. Bellamy's small parlor, her face pale and streaked with soot, a persistent cough shaking her thin frame, but very much alive and alert despite the ordeal. "Alara," Margaret said weakly, reaching out as her daughter rushed to her side, dropping to her knees beside the chair and gathering her mother's hands carefully in her own. "I was so frightened," Alara said, tears finally spilling freely now that the immediate crisis had passed and left room for the full weight of emotion to settle in. "Are you truly unhurt?" "Only shaken," Margaret assured her, though her voice remained rough from smoke. "Mrs. Bellamy pulled me out before the flames reached the stairs. I lost some things, I fear, and the front room is badly damaged, but I am alive, and that is what matters most." "What of the silk?" Alara asked, though the question felt almost foolish given the circumstances. "Gone, I believe," Margaret said with a tired, resigned sigh. "Most of it was still stored in the front room. I am sorry, my dear. I know how much it meant." "It does not matter," Alara said firmly, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. "Fabric can be replaced, you cannot." Alistair, who had remained quietly nearby throughout this exchange, stepped forward now, his expression grave but composed. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "I am relieved beyond words to see you safe. Please allow me to arrange proper medical care immediately and suitable lodging for as long as necessary while repairs are made to your home. Your Grace, I could not possibly accept, Margaret began, though her protest lacked real conviction given her obvious exhaustion. You can and you will, Alastair said with gentle firmness. This is not charity, Mrs. Whitmore. It is simply what one does for family, and I hope, in time, you will come to think of me as exactly that. Margaret's tired eyes softened at his words, and though she said nothing further in protest, the grateful expression on her face spoke clearly enough of her acceptance. Over the following days, as Margaret recovered under the care of a skilled physician Alastair had personally arranged, questions began to circulate regarding the true cause of the fire. While the initial assumption had been a simple accident, an overturned lamp left unattended, further investigation by workers Alastair had quietly hired to assess the damage revealed troubling inconsistencies. The lamp in question had been found in a location that made an accidental overturn highly unlikely, and traces of oil had been discovered along the base of the front window, suggesting the fire may have originated from an external source rather than a household accident. Alastair kept these findings largely to himself at first, unwilling to make accusations without sufficient evidence, though his suspicions immediately turned toward Cassandra, given the timing so soon after her public humiliation at the Harrington ball. He dispatched Edmund to make careful, discreet inquiries throughout the neighborhood, asking whether anyone had noticed unfamiliar faces near the shop in the hours before the fire began. The answer came from an elderly neighbor, Mr. Delacroix, who mentioned almost in passing that he had seen a hired carriage, unfamiliar to the street, waiting nearby earlier that evening, and had noticed a figure moving quickly away from the direction of the shop shortly before the alarm was raised. He could not identify the person with certainty, given the poor lighting and his own failing eyesight, but the description he offered, a woman in a dark cloak moving with hurried, deliberate steps, was enough to strengthen Alastair's growing suspicions considerably. He did not share these suspicions with Alara immediately, unwilling to add further distress to an already difficult time, focusing instead on ensuring Margaret's full recovery and beginning the necessary repairs to restore their damaged home. It was during this period of quiet recovery that Alara found herself reflecting deeply on everything that had unfolded since that fateful afternoon in Verity's shop. She thought of the silk, now lost entirely to the fire, and found that its loss troubled her far less than she might have expected. What remained far more valuable, she realized, was everything that fabric had set into motion, the friendship, the trust, the deep and steady affection that had grown between herself and Alastair despite every obstacle placed in their path. "I have been thinking," she said to him one evening, as they sat together in the small, temporary lodging he had arranged for her and her mother while repairs continued on their home, "about how strange it is that something as simple as fabric could lead us here to this moment." "I do not think it was truly about the fabric at all," Alastair said thoughtfully. "I think the silk was simply the excuse I needed to finally act on what I already felt the moment I watched you walk out of that shop with such quiet dignity. The fabric mattered far less than what it represented, a refusal to let cruelty define your worth." "You give me too much credit," Alara said softly. "I nearly cried the entire walk home that day." "And yet you did not cry in front of them," Alastair said. "You held yourself with more grace in that single humiliating moment than most people manage in an entire lifetime of comfortable ease. That is not something easily taught, Alara. It comes from something deeper, something I have admired in you more with every day that has passed since." Alara felt her heart swell with warmth at his words, though a lingering worry still pressed at the edges of her thoughts. "What of Cassandra?" she asked quietly. "Do you truly believe she was responsible for the fire?" Alastair's expression grew serious. "I believe it is possible," he admitted, finally sharing his suspicions and the evidence Edmund had gathered, "though I have no absolute proof yet, only circumstantial suggestion. I intend to pursue the matter carefully, without endangering your mother's safety or yours any further, but I will not allow such an act, if it was indeed deliberate, to go entirely unanswered." "I do not wish for further conflict," Alara said, though her voice carried a firm edge beneath its gentleness. "I only wish for this to finally be over, for my mother to feel safe in her own home again, for us to be able to build our lives without constantly looking over our shoulders for the next attack." "Then that is precisely what we shall build," Alastair said, taking her hands in his own with quiet, unwavering resolve. Whatever remains to be settled with Cassandra, I promise you it will not overshadow the life I intend for us to build together. You have endured more than enough uncertainty, Alara. It is time the world understood, beyond any possible doubt, exactly where you stand and exactly how deeply you are valued. Within days, the repairs to Margaret's shop neared completion, funded quietly and generously by Alastair despite Margaret's repeated, gentle protests, and the neighborhood of Miller Street began slowly returning to its familiar rhythms. Yet beneath the surface of this recovery, both Alara and Alastair understood that one final reckoning remained before their story could move forward entirely unburdened by the shadow of Cassandra's jealousy and the damage it had nearly caused. That reckoning would come soon enough, in a manner neither of them fully anticipated, drawing every thread of their journey together toward its final, decisive resolution. The proof, when it finally arrived, came not through any deliberate investigation, but through an unexpected confession that took even Alastair by surprise. Cassandra's own maid, a young woman named Bridget who had served her for nearly 3 years, appeared unannounced at the Ravelmoor estate one grey morning, her hands twisting nervously in front of her, clearly torn between fear and the weight of a guilty conscience she could no longer bear alone. "Your Grace," she said, once Edmund had shown her into the study where Alastair sat reviewing correspondence, "I must speak with you about something that has troubled me greatly these past weeks. I fear my silence has already caused enough harm, and I cannot allow it to continue any further." Alastair set down his pen immediately, giving the young woman his full attention. "Please sit," he said gently, sensing the significance of whatever she had come to share. "Take whatever time you need." Bridget explained, haltingly at first and then with growing steadiness, that on the night of the fire, Lady Cassandra had left the house late in the evening under the pretense of visiting a friend, only to return several hours later in a state of visible agitation, her cloak smelling faintly of smoke and oil. She had ordered Bridget to burn the cloak immediately and to say nothing of the evening's events to anyone, a demand that had troubled Bridget deeply ever since, particularly once news of the fire on Miller Street had reached the household staff the following morning. "I did not wish to believe it of her, Your Grace," Bridget said, tears gathering in her eyes. "I told myself it must have been coincidence, that surely she would not do something so terrible, but I have not been able to sleep peacefully since, knowing what I suspect and having said nothing. When I heard that Miss Whitmore's family had lost their home, I knew I could remain silent no longer, regardless of what it might cost me." "You have done the right thing in coming forward," Alastair assured her, his voice steady despite the anger building quietly beneath his composed exterior. "You need not fear any consequence from sharing this truth. Your honesty took considerable courage, and it will not go unrewarded." With Bridget's testimony now added to Mr. Delacroix's earlier account, and the physical evidence Edmund had already gathered, Alastair finally possessed enough to bring the matter formally before the appropriate authorities, though he chose first to confront Cassandra directly, believing she deserved the opportunity to face the consequences of her actions honestly rather than through public scandal alone. He arrived at the Pemberton estate that same afternoon, finding Cassandra in her private garden, her expression turning wary the moment she recognized his approach. "Your Grace," she said carefully, rising from her seat. "This is an unexpected visit." "I imagine it is," Alastair said, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. "I have come to discuss the fire at Miller Street." Cassandra's face paled slightly, though she quickly composed herself. "I know nothing of any fire beyond what has been discussed throughout the city these past days. A terrible accident from what I understand." "It was no accident," Alastair said, watching her closely. "I have witnesses, Lady Cassandra, and evidence that places you at the scene, along with testimony from your own household regarding your behavior that same evening. I would strongly advise against continuing to deny your involvement." For a long moment, Cassandra said nothing at all, her carefully constructed composure finally beginning to crumble entirely under the weight of undeniable truth. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost all its earlier confidence, replaced instead by something raw and exhausted. "I did not intend for it to spread so far," she admitted quietly, sinking back into her seat as though her legs could no longer support her. "I only meant to frighten her, to damage the shop enough to force her family to leave the city entirely, to remove her from your life before things progressed any further. I never intended for anyone to be harmed." "Intent does not undo the harm that was caused," Alastair said, though something in his tone softened slightly, recognizing the genuine distress now visible beneath her admission. Mrs. Whitmore very nearly did not escape in time, Cassandra. You placed an innocent woman's life at risk out of jealousy and wounded pride. Cassandra's eyes filled with tears, though whether from genuine remorse or simple fear of consequence, Alastair could not entirely determine. What will you do? She asked quietly. That depends a great deal on what you are willing to do yourself, Alastair said. A full and public confession, along with appropriate compensation for the damage caused, would go a considerable way toward tempering whatever consequences might otherwise follow. I have no particular wish to see your family's name destroyed entirely, despite everything you have done, but I will not allow this matter to be quietly buried either. Mrs. Whitmore and Alara deserve justice, and the truth deserves to be known. Cassandra, faced with the undeniable collapse of every scheme she had constructed, and the very real possibility of far more severe consequences should the matter proceed through formal legal channels, ultimately agreed to Alastair's terms. Within the week, a formal statement was issued acknowledging her responsibility for the fire and the earlier campaign of false rumors against Alara, accompanied by substantial financial compensation for the damage caused, and a public apology delivered, with considerable difficulty, at a smaller gathering arranged specifically for that purpose. It was not a perfect resolution, and Alara found that she could not fully forgive Cassandra for the danger she had placed her mother in, though she accepted the apology with as much grace as she could manage, recognizing that continued bitterness would serve no one, least of all herself. With the matter finally and publicly resolved, the whispers and rumors that had followed Alara since her first appearance at the gala faded away almost entirely, replaced instead by genuine admiration for the quiet strength and dignity she had displayed throughout the entire ordeal. Society, ever quick to shift its favor, now spoke of her not as an opportunistic seamstress's daughter, but as a woman of remarkable character who had faced considerable adversity with grace and emerged from it stronger rather than diminished. Margaret's shop was fully restored within weeks, more beautiful than before thanks to Alastair's generous support, and business returned steadily as former clients, embarrassed by their earlier hasty judgments, quietly resumed their patronage alongside a growing number of new customers eager to be associated with the now well-regarded Whitmore name. It was on a crisp winter evening, several weeks after the final resolution of Cassandra's scheming, that Alastair finally found the opportunity to complete what he had begun to say on the night of the fire, an opportunity he had waited for with growing impatience despite understanding entirely why it had needed to wait. He arranged a quiet dinner at the Ravelmoor estate, just the two of them, in a small private room warmed by a generous fire and lit by soft candlelight that reminded Alara, not unpleasantly, of the very silk that had first brought them together all those months before. I have been waiting for the right moment to finish what I began saying to you at the Harrington ball, Alastair said, once their meal had concluded and they sat together near the fire, his expression more nervous than she had ever seen from him before. Though I confess I am no longer certain there is ever truly a perfect moment for such things, only the courage to seize whatever moment presents itself. Alara felt her heart quicken, sensing what was coming even before he continued, though she said nothing, allowing him the space to find his own words. Alara Whitmore, he said, rising from his seat and moving to kneel before her, taking her hands gently in his own. From the moment I watched you walk out of that shop with more dignity than I have witnessed in a lifetime of formal society, I knew there was something extraordinary about you, something I could not simply walk away from. I have spent every day since then more certain of one truth than any other I have known in my entire life, that I love you entirely and without reservation, and that I wish to spend the rest of my days by your side, whatever challenges that path might bring. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring set with a single deep blue stone that caught the candlelight in a way that reminded her, unmistakably, of the very silk that had started everything between them. "Will you marry me, Alara?" he asked softly. "Will you allow me the honor of building a life together, one where you never again need to wonder whether you belong somewhere, because you will belong wherever I am, and I intend to make certain the entire world understands that truth as clearly as I already do." Tears filled Alara's eyes, though this time they carried nothing but overwhelming joy. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with happiness. "Yes, Alastair, I will marry you. He rose and gathered her into his arms, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke at all, simply content to hold one another in the warm glow of the fire, the weight of everything they had endured together finally settling into something that felt, at last, entirely and permanently secure. Their wedding, held the following spring, became the talk of the entire city, not for its scandal or unusual circumstances, but for its genuine warmth and the obvious happiness shared between bride and groom. Alara wore a gown crafted from new silk, a deep and beautiful blue that Margaret had sewn with steady, joyful hands, no longer aching from the cold but strengthened by months of proper care and rest that her daughter's new circumstances had afforded her. Lady Cassandra was not among the guests, having quietly withdrawn from fashionable society in the months following her public reckoning, though word eventually reached Alara that she had traveled to the countryside, seeking, perhaps, the kind of genuine self-reflection that her earlier life of careful appearances had never allowed her to pursue. As Alara stood at the front of the grand church on her wedding day, looking out at the gathered faces of family, friends, and even a fair number of former society skeptics now smiling warmly in her direction, she thought back to that afternoon in Verity's shop, to the humiliation she had endured and the quiet dignity she had somehow managed to hold on to despite it all. She thought of the silk that had arrived at her door with no name attached, of the tall, quiet stranger who had watched her leave a room with her head held high, and decided, in that single moment, that such strength deserved to be recognized rather than mocked. She had been told that day that the silk was not for her, and yet here she stood, wrapped once more in its deep, beautiful blue, about to become the Duchess of Ravelmoor, proof beyond any doubt that worth was never truly determined by birth or circumstance, but by the quiet strength a person carried within themselves, regardless of who tried to convince them otherwise. Alastair took her hand as the ceremony began, his eyes filled with a warmth that promised everything their future together would hold, and as they exchanged their vows before all who had gathered to witness it, Alara felt, for the first time in her entire life, completely and unquestionably certain of exactly where she belonged. The years that followed brought a quiet, steady happiness that neither Alara nor Alastair had ever truly dared to imagine for themselves, before their paths crossed in that small, crowded shop over a bolt of blue silk. Ravelmoor Estate, once a place of solemn quiet and long, empty hallways, gradually filled with warmth and laughter, its rooms brightened not only by new furnishings and fresh flowers, but by the genuine joy of a household finally at peace with itself. Margaret moved into a comfortable cottage on the estate grounds within the first year of the marriage, close enough to remain an active part of her daughter's life, but independent enough to continue the work she loved, training a small group of local girls in the art of fine tailoring, passing along skills she had spent a lifetime perfecting. Her hands, once aching constantly from cold and years of labor, grew steadier and stronger under the care of proper rest and warmth, and she often remarked, with quiet wonder, that she had never expected her later years to bring such unexpected comfort. Alara herself found purpose beyond her new title, using her position and the resources now available to her to establish a small foundation supporting young women from modest backgrounds who showed talent and dedication in trades like her mother's, offering them training, fair wages, and opportunities that had never been available to Alara herself during her own early years of struggle. She often visited the workshops personally, sitting alongside the young seamstresses and offering guidance, never forgetting the humiliation she had once endured in a shop much like the ones she now helped support, determined that no other young woman should have to face such treatment without someone standing ready to help. Alastair, for his part, found that his years of quiet withdrawal from society gave way naturally to a renewed sense of purpose and engagement with the world around him. He became known throughout the region not simply as a wealthy and distant duke, but as a fair and thoughtful landlord, quick to address the concerns of tenants and workers alike, his earlier reputation for coldness replaced entirely by genuine warmth that those who knew him well had always suspected lay beneath the surface, waiting only for the right circumstances to draw it forward. Word of their story, the humiliation in the shop, the mysterious gift of silk, the public confrontation that had ultimately revealed the truth of Cassandra's schemes, spread throughout the region over the years, told and retold until it became something of a local legend, a reminder that kindness and dignity, even in the face of cruelty, rarely went entirely unnoticed or unrewarded. Young women throughout the city, particularly those from humble circumstances, spoke of Alara with genuine admiration, finding in her story a quiet source of hope that their own circumstances need not permanently define the limits of their future happiness. Lady Cassandra, meanwhile, spent several years away from the city, living quietly in the countryside with distant relatives who had little interest in the fashionable circles she had once dedicated her entire life to impressing. In time, word reached Alara, through Charlotte's occasional correspondence, that Cassandra had gradually built a smaller, quieter life for herself, eventually marrying a modest but kind country gentleman and stepping away entirely from the ambitions that had once consumed her so completely. Whether she had ever found genuine peace with the events of that difficult year, Alara could not say for certain, though she found, with some surprise, that she no longer carried any real bitterness toward the woman who had once tried so hard to destroy her happiness. Time and the quiet security of the life she had built had softened even that old wound into something manageable, something that no longer held any real power over her. Alara and Alastair welcomed their first child 2 years into their marriage, a daughter with her mother's steady, thoughtful eyes and her father's quiet strength of character, followed several years later by a son who inherited, much to Alastair's amusement, his mother's sharp wit and refusal to be intimidated by anyone, regardless of their rank or standing. The children grew up surrounded by warmth and genuine affection, taught from an early age that true worth had nothing to do with titles or fortune, but everything to do with honesty, kindness, and the courage to hold one's dignity even when others tried to strip it away. On quiet evenings, long after the children had been put to bed, Alara and Alastair often sat together near the same fireplace where he had first proposed, reflecting on the strange, winding path that had brought them together. They spoke sometimes of Verity's shop, now expanded considerably under new ownership, still selling fine silks to the city's wealthy patrons, though Alara made certain, each season, to purchase at least a small length of fabric there herself, a quiet reminder of everything that single afternoon of humiliation had eventually led toward. "Do you ever regret how it began?" Alastair asked her once, many years into their marriage, watching the firelight dance across her face as their youngest child slept peacefully in her arms. The cruelty of that day, before any of this good fortune followed. Alara considered the question carefully before answering, her eyes soft with the wisdom of years spent building a life far richer than she had ever imagined possible during that painful walk home from the shop. "I do not think I would change it," she said finally. "That day taught me something important about my own strength, something I might never have discovered otherwise, and it led me to you, to this life, to everything I now hold dear. I have learned that even our most difficult moments often carry within them the seeds of something far greater than we could have imagined at the time, if only we have the patience and courage to see them through." Alastair reached over and took her free hand in his own, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, the same gesture he had offered her on the night they first properly met, all those years before. "Then I suppose," he said softly, "we owe a great debt to a room full of cruel women and a single bolt of silk that was never truly meant for anyone but you." Alara smiled, leaning gently against his shoulder as the fire crackled softly before them, their children sleeping peacefully upstairs, their lives woven together as securely and beautifully as the finest silk ever crafted, a life built not on the approval of a judgmental society, but on the quiet, unshakable foundation of genuine love, mutual respect, and the simple, powerful truth that no one, regardless of where they came from, should ever be told that something meant for them was not truly theirs to claim. And so their story settled, not into legend or scandal, but into the quiet, enduring happiness of an ordinary life extraordinarily well lived, proof enough that dignity, once claimed and never surrendered, could carry a person further than any inheritance of wealth or title ever could alone.